Welcome to Firstline, I'm Daniel Pizarro. A Senate inquiry interim report has been released into the country's youth justice system today. It comes following the death of a young Aboriginal boy in custody in 2023 in WA, and also amid concerns about the high rate of incarceration among Indigenous children. The issues are spreading across the country, including Alice Springs in the Northern Territory, and a surge in youth crime in the New England Northwest. Earlier today, I spoke to New South Wales Greens Senator David Shoebridge about what he thinks about the report's interim findings. Well, Senator Shoebridge, thank you very much for joining me here on Firstline. Within a matter of minutes now, you've just completed this report into youth justice systems that you managed to get enough Senate support last year to get underway. First, what has been some of the key findings of this report?
Well, I think one of the most important things about this report is it's the first time the federal parliament has really sat down and had a look at what is unquestionably a crisis in youth justice across the country. And the report, I think, sets out the evidence that we got from children's commissioners, the National Children's Commissioner, children's commissioners for each state and territory, from legal advocates, from law reformers, and from communities. And they were all saying the same thing, that the youth justice system across the country is in crisis. It is harming young and vulnerable children, and it's ultimately not making communities any safer. And I think that evidence, the unanimity of that evidence was, incredibly disturbing, but also compelling.
What were some of the most stand-out points that really drove you to saying we really need to have reforms and changes in the youth justice system?
Well, I've been in contact with my state and territory counterparts, for the last 3 years, doing this job as a national justice spokesperson for the Greens, and there is this incredibly disturbing pattern that has now crept into pretty much every state and territory jurisdiction. It's probably at its worst in the Northern Territory, Queensland, and WA, but it's consistent across the country, of state and territory governments deliberately crafting policies and law reform that makes the criminal justice system harsher and meaner for children than it is for adults. And those changes, very brutal changes, dealing with kids as young as 10, go directly against a whole series of national commitments that those state and territory governments have signed up to, and that the Commonwealth government is meant to be leading, about reducing the number of kids in jail, about closing the gap on First Nations justice. And, the rhetoric is going in one direction, but the reality has been going so brutally in the opposite.
That is quite something to hear about, because we know, and as you know, we've recently had quite a surge in juvenile crime in the New England Northwest, and of course we're having a lot of controversies about cases happening in the Northern Territory. And then when you take into effect what's happening in the judicial system at the same time, and of course we've had Indigenous deaths in custody, we've had the various controversies surrounding what goes on in correctional centres. This is a situation that, if it's not solved, what kind of consequences could we really see? Could we see some of the worst antisocial behaviour, as well as a complete collapse in some societal ranks?
Well, all the evidence about how you deal with youth offending, it all says the same thing. All the evidence that is at least based in reliable research, it says that youth offending is a function of often housing, terrible crisis in housing, and that's probably the worst in the Northern Territory, but it's chronic in many regional parts of my home state of New South Wales and across the country. You know, when you have 30 people sharing a 3-bedroom, poorly maintained house, literally sleeping in shifts, you know, it creates circumstances in which kids are not properly supervised, in which they can't engage in learning, and in which they're spending, you know, an inappropriate amount of the time literally out on the streets where they're prey to antisocial behaviour. We know that not investing in public education and not investing in programs that keep marginalised kids at school, and it can sometimes be as simple as providing breakfast and lunch. We know that not dealing with young people's health conditions, whether it's an ear infection or an eye infection, or they might have been born with a condition like FASD, fetal alcohol syndrome, and not dealing with those health conditions leads to a dislocation at school, a dislocation with society, and then can show up in youth offending. You know, all the evidence says fund those core services, fund housing, fund education, fund health, deliver those services through community-run organisations that are connected to their community, so we know the money's getting where it's needed and it's delivered in a culturally appropriate way. And you do that, and you consistently do that, and you drive youth offending rates down dramatically. We also know that there is literally a prison pipeline. Once you start feeding children into the youth detention centres, then you're almost certainly going to see this spike in adult offending over the rest of a person's life. So all the evidence says jailing is failing, but we know what the evidence says is needed to actually systemically address youth offending, but state and territory governments refuse to follow that evidence and instead are looking for like a sugar hit with radio shock jocks and the right-wing media, and suggesting that you can jail your way out of this, and you simply cannot.
On that remark that you've just made, I have been speaking to quite a lot of the members of the Tamworth Indigenous community, and I know that we also face quite a lot of antisocial behaviour, crime, domestic violence, especially in certain areas like Coaldale and West Tamworth. There has been from some members of the Indigenous community that a few bad apples are trying to use or trying to take advantage of the situation by saying that they have intergenerational trauma, or that they are saying like, you're just arresting me because I'm Aboriginal, or they're trying to accuse anyone in a position of authority of racism, and they're trying to get away with that. Can you understand why there could be some people who might be trying to just be, you know, troublemakers, and regardless of what you are trying to do, will be someone who for some reason wants to just be on the bad side of society and then use their heritage as an excuse?
Well, addressing the causes of youth offending isn't excusing bad behaviour. But these two things are entirely separate. If you want to address the causes of youth offending, which I would imagine most people want their governments to do, then invest in policies that address the causes of youth offending. And you know, much of that policy response has to come to terms with the fact that we do have some in-ground racism in the criminal justice system. And, you know, there's comprehensive data that shows First Nations peoples engaging in certain activity are far more likely to be arrested, far more likely, if they are arrested, to be convicted, far more likely, if they are convicted, to go to jail, and if they go to jail, far more likely to go to jail for a longer period than non-First Nations peoples. And that's, you know, the evidence of that is unchallengeable. So there is an inherent racist bias in the criminal justice system, as there is an inherent racist bias in how we share resources in this country. You know, First Nations people in their own country have a far less access to resources than the non-First Nations community. So we can't ignore that systemic racism. But, you know, nobody puts that forward as a defence to an individual instance of offending. And nobody suggests that, you know, addressing individual offending um, shouldn't be part of our criminal justice system. I suppose the bigger question that people should be asking of their governments is, in 10 years' time, what are the policies we're going to put in place that can radically reduce offending, can make our societies more equal and fairer, and make all of our communities feel safer? And that's the challenge that state and territory governments, I think, are fundamentally failing.
We have this report out, as you've just said. What is the next step? We are about to go into a federal election, and we know crime from whatever the federal government, regardless if it's a Labor or a coalition government, will be tasked with dealing from their federal perspective aspects regarding tackling the youth crime, the juvenile system, the justice system, from a federal perspective. What are you hoping to get?
Well, the principal recommendation from this inquiry, which we kicked off at the end of last year, and we've, you know, and I give credit to the chair and the professional team in the Secretariat and the Senate who helped us get this report delivered in such a short period of time. The critical recommendation is the next Parliament needs to take this work on and have a look at whether or not the federal Parliament should be setting minimum standards to make sure that if there are child detention facilities, that they are safe, to make sure that our state and territory laws meet our international obligations to respect the rights of children, and also look at what funding agreements are required to force states and territories to deliver the policies that keep children safe and communities safe. That's what this report says in bright lights. And what I'm hoping is that as we go into a federal election, and if the issue of youth justice is brought up, that this report shows an evidence-based set of solutions that we can adopt. And it will show that the nonsense of the talk of Peter Dutton to just jail your way out of a problem, it shows that is not the answer. We know what the answers are. They are about long-term funding. They're about dealing with people's essential needs. They're about removing systemic racism out of the criminal justice system. They're not about giving people a free pass for offending behaviour. Nobody is suggesting that. But if you want a safer society, you have to start building it based on evidence.
Given that you have been involved in this field for many years, one particular place I'm very interested in knowing is the situation in Alice Springs in the Northern Territory. We know that over the past couple of years, there's been everything from the previous John Howard intervention to curfews to grog bans. We have seen some violence come back in, particularly around the town camps, and areas of domestic violence being a very serious issue. From your experience and perspective, are things getting better or worse in Alice Springs, or is it still the status quo?
Well, I mean, I'm not the person to pass judgment on Alice Springs. You know, I speak to organisations like NAJA. I talk to our Greens on the ground. I talk to the advocates who are looking for alternate solutions to replace disastrous to be an expert to resolve what's happening on the ground in Alice Springs. But I'll tell you who are experts: the elders and community leaders in Alice Springs, who, if you listen, are saying, give us the resources, give us the respect, give us the powers locally to community-run, First Nations-run organisations, so they can provide the circle sentencing. They can provide guidance from elders. They can provide the community-run education and medical services. They can help deliver the housing and deal with some of the most appalling housing conditions in the country. If you're looking for the solutions from Alice Springs, I'd urge you, and I'd urge state and federal governments to put in place structures and resources so that we get those solutions coming from those leaders and community groups on the ground. That's what I'm also hearing from the children's commissioners, and that's what we also heard loud and clear in this inquiry.
And could we have a similar implementation here in Tamworth and other areas like Moree, which we also know have been dealing with a lot of the same issues that Alice Springs have?
Well, we know that the laws recently passed by the New South Wales government to make it even harder for largely First Nations kids to get bail in Moree. We know they won't work. That's what the evidence tells us. We know that won't make Moree safer in the short or medium term, let alone the long term. And I've had the great fortune of speaking with some well-respected elders in the Tamworth region, and I know that they are desperately looking for the assistance from state and territory governments, from state and federal government, to be able to deliver those services locally. They want to work with their young people. They have the cultural authority to work with their young people. They want to share that cultural authority. Tens of thousands of years of structured cultural approaches, and they want to be respected and resourced. And instead, what we get from the New South Wales state government is more police, aggressive, unfair changes to the bail laws, and potentially more of those kids being taken away from those very elders and communities that, if they were resourced, could put them on the right track, into juvenile prisons that we know are a pipeline to adult jail. So the answers will be different, but the core task of federal and state governments across the country is the same. Resource the knowledge keepers, resource the local communities, respect them, and invest in successful communities.
Green Senator David Shoebridge there. Last week on Firstline, we brought you the story of the South Australian government placing the Whyalla Steelworks into administration, with GFG Alliance, the company that operated the steelworks, reportedly owing hundreds of millions of dollars to creditors and suppliers. Well, that figure now has mushroomed to $1 billion, though GFG Alliance claims they're owed half that money, as they count themselves as a creditor. Earlier this week, I spoke to State Member for Giles, Eddie Hughes. He told me about the chronology of why the South Australian government decided to place the steelworks into administration, as well as his thoughts on the federal government's $2.4 billion bailout package for the company's employees, though not a cent will go to GFG Alliance. Well, Mr. Hughes, thank you very much for joining us. The entire Australian community has been fixated on what's been going on in Whyalla because we know how important that steelworks is for the Australian steel manufacturing industry. I know it's over 75% of the domestic output, but we also know that that steelworks is the DNA of Whyalla and South Australia. How are you feeling over the past week? Because putting a company into administration by legislation is not something that happens every day.
Well, it certainly isn't. I think it might be unprecedented, but there was a need to do something unprecedented. The steelworks has been run into the ground, and as you've implied, the steelworks in Whyalla is part of our sovereign manufacturing capacity. It is the only integrated steelworks in the country that produces structural steel and rail using our ore on our doorstep. So it's an incredibly important part of our manufacturing capacity. And you could not just sit back and watch what was happening. And I know the steelworks well. I've been down there. I used to work there, albeit many years ago. And one of my sons is a leading hand maintenance fitter at the steel mill. So I'm told on a daily basis about what is going on, the lack of proactive maintenance, what is happening to the plant. So as a state government, we could not sit back. We were over all the promises that were made, that we'd run out of confidence and we had run out of trust. So action needed to be taken, and it was unprecedented action, but that just shows you how dire we believe that the circumstances were.
I know that the state government had begun looking into the GFG Alliance's handling of the steelworks around late December. For you, when did you feel that things were going really downhill? Because the last time we were at the steelworks, there was that huge announcement in early 2023. The Premier was there, you and I were there, and there was this huge push by what this company was announcing and what they were being pushing. So what happened?
Well, that was the electric arc furnace announcement, and within a very short period of that announcement, the company started to change its act. I guess I was one of those people that was somewhat skeptical about some of the claims that were being made earlier on. I always, when companies come to Whyalla, whether they're tire kickers or serious companies, I always give my usual spiel and do not go out to the Whyalla community and promise the world. So I always go on the promise and over deliver. Unfortunately, with GFG, from very early on in the piece, we got the complete top. We had the big reveal where Morrison was the Prime Minister at the time, was there. Stephen Marshall, the opposition leader, federal opposition leader, was there. The leader of the state opposition was there. It was a big deal. I sort of listened to it with an open mind. But somewhat skeptical. And I guess my view started to coalesce when Sanjeev Gupta, in what seemed like a thought bubble to me, said, "Why we can have a population of 80,000 people." At the time, we had 22,000, and that line was being repeated, and I thought it was incredibly irresponsible. So my skepticism grew, I guess, at an early stage. I mean, he did have one redeeming feature. He was a Paul Power sponsor, so that was. But otherwise, I just got a little bit more skeptical and more skeptical and more skeptical as time went on. In fact, back 5-6 years ago now, the Financial Times interviewed me, and they asked what I thought of Sanjeev Gupta. My guard was down, and they actually said something quite explicit. I'm not going to repeat it here. It's but I was already skeptical. But when the electric arc furnace was announced, I did speak to one of their senior people. So I said, "We just seen the contract signed off." I said, "I haven't seen what the out clauses are in that contract. Can you give me any assurance?" He said, "Yeah, it's in the waiting list. Yeah, we're committed to doing this." But within a few weeks, the way the electric arc furnace was being portrayed, that started to change, and then there's some other changes. And initially, it was all going to be internally financed. Then it wasn't going to be internally financed. Initially, it was going to be predominantly scrap, which raised a lot of questions in my head about using. And electric arc furnaces, they're traditionally used as scrap. But Whyalla's advantage is the fact that we've got the ore on our doorstep, and using scrap raised a whole raft of logistical issues given Whyalla's location, and it raised issues about the availability of scrap domestically within Australia. So I just go, this sounds all a little bit odd. Then they started talking about what we call direct reduction iron making, which made a lot of sense because you're using your ore here in Whyalla. We've got a lot of it on our doorstep. But this was all dependent then on a joint venture. And I was highly dubious about the company being able to secure a joint venture given its reputational damage, and especially if GFG was going to retain majority control.
Now, coming up to the timeline frame, we know that the state government had been discussing the possibility of the future of the steelworks in December, and were actively starting to speak to the administrators that would eventually take over the country.
Was actively speaking to administrators, but concern about the steelworks went further back than just December last year. And so there's a range of concerns, and I guess the tempo of those concerns increased as time went on. And I guess when you start to get into December and or just before, and the advice we were getting, things were coming to a head, and then it was a case of putting in place what was the ultimate strategy, because the state government was planning for a whole range of different contingencies, and ultimately we settled on the need to have legislative change in order to give the state the power to push the operations here in Whyalla into administration.
And that was done very quickly. You managed to get that legislation introduced to the House of Assembly within about 15 minutes, and then it passed the Legislative Council. This was very rapid action, because when
I think this was also unprecedented, and there was the need to do that, because what we were reliant upon with this legislative change was the fact that GFG owed us money for water and money for royalties. So that gave us the in. But if we would have done the normal process, administrative process, that would have been taken ages. And it's entirely possible that what we were owed, what the state was owed, never mind the hundreds of millions owed to other creditors, what we were owed would be paid off. So it was clear that we managed to blindside the GFG when it came to the actions we were taken, and it was incredibly important that legislation that was introduced into lower house passed incredibly quickly, and as soon as it was, and then across the road to the governor to sign off on the assent. So it was. I don't think it's ever been done before in an Australian Parliament, but I think it's a reflection of just how we viewed the situation and how serious we thought it was.
We know, because given the fact that the Whyalla Steelworks for the past decade has gone through a lot of financial turbulence. It's previously been in administration in 2016 after it was spun off, and then the future of not just the steelworks but the entire city of Whyalla has often been in discussion, given the fact that we know that this steelworks employs over 3,000 people directly, and then if you take away that entire infrastructure and that company, then the entire town could potentially collapse. While we know that would be very unlikely for anyone to allow that to really happen, it does show how tedious in many ways the management and the operations of the steelworks is, even though it's so important to Whyalla and to the Australian economy.
Yeah, and there's always that that national perspective when it came to sovereign manufacturing, the capacity, but also the localized perspective, just how reliant the Whyalla community is on both the mines and the value adding from the mines in the steelworks. So it's crucial. It's the estimate that was done during the last administration, when you look at direct employment and employment that was dependent upon the mines and the steelworks, we're talking about over 4,000 people. So we've got a population of just under 22,000, and a labour market that's probably in the order of around about, and this is a rough figure, maybe a labour market of 10,000 people. So you're looking at almost half of your workforce being wiped out, and then but then the impact that would have on the ongoing impact that would have on the community. So there was a real need for intervention, and sometimes I read, especially in papers like the Australian or the commentary or the comments, they almost total indifference. Maybe the readership of that paper has to regional communities like Whyalla. I mean, that sort of line, why are we bothering to do this, a whole raft of stuff, and absolutely no appreciation, no empathy, and often absolutely no knowledge or experience of the steel industry.
We also have now this $2.4 billion federal government package, which, it has to be stated, is not going to GFG. It's going straight to the workers of the Whyalla Steelworks. And we know that right off today, Koromantha has reassured all the staff who are taking leave, holidays and all that, that they will be able to keep being able to do that, because there were fears among a lot of the workers that time and holidays that they have just put in or put in several weeks ago would not be carried through. So you'd had potentially some very tired or very frustrated workers who would be very worried about their future. But we do know as of today that they will be allowed to take leave. Are operations just pretty much running normally at the moment?
And yes, they're running normally. Iron has been made, steel has been produced. Koromantha have got a hard job in front of them. It's good that it looks like BlueScope are going to play an advisory role. And the thing about Koromantha is that they've been here before. They know the steelworks. They know the community. And there was some difficulties the last time because people had to take ultimately voted on a 10% pay cut, and that that did not go down well. But ultimately the workforce voted for it. I've been given an assurance this time there's not going to be any pay cuts, and people's conditions are going to be looked after. And it's important that those accrued benefits are also available to the workforce.
Is there anything about potential job losses or job cuts or anything happening there?
No, it's my understanding that there's not going to be at Steelworks. There's not going to be any job losses. And indeed, when it was still owned by GFG, they flagged that it was actually understaffed. And others areas of the plant were there. Yeah, they've got shortages of tradies and operators, and that can be deeply concerning. Yeah, given the nature of an integrated steelworks, it's not just a pressure that staff workers get put on them, but it's always that in the background, always that concern around safety, and that then becomes amplified when you've got a plant that has had little in the way of proactive and so that combination of the two things, insufficient maintenance and understaffing in some areas, that is concerning. So, those things are going to be addressed. Now, the package of 2.4 billion is broken up. There's 1.9 billion on the table for a potential new owner. And then there's about 384 million, I think it is, for to operate the plant during this period of administration.
Do we have any indication now about a certain time frame for when Koromantha is looking to potentially find the suitable buyer and for those new buyers to take full ownership and operation of the steelworks? I know that the federal government is possibly mooting. They might have a golden share in the steelworks to help keep things stabilised, but of course it will need a proper full-time majority owner or a consortium that would be able to run this facility, as well as to avoid all those previous mistakes that the previous owners, including GFG, have.
Yeah, and you make some points there about learning from the past. Obviously, you want the administration to be as short as possible, but we also want an incredibly thorough due diligence process when it comes to a transition to either a new owner or a consortium. So the sooner the better. If we can find a new owner, it's so it's the last administration went for around about 17 months. And it was interesting that towards the pointy end of that, when the successful bidder was going to be selected, it was the Korean entities that were the preferred bidder, and that changed at the last moment. I think the nature of the offer, but I think the Koreans also wanted an extension of time, and I guess the view of the administrators was that it had already been an administration for 17 months or thereabouts, and there needed to be. They needed to have a new owner, and Sanjeev Gupta had made the bid. You could argue, and hindsight's a great thing. You could argue that maybe the due diligence would have been more thorough. And some people have put it to me, well, it should have been Aussie companies. But some of the Aussie companies that had bids in were going to just break the what was Arium up, and a number of the Aussie companies saw the steelworks as a liability. So the interest was in the Eastern Seaboard operations and potentially the iron ore. The iron ore prices had been a little bit depressed and did start to escalate. Yeah, not long after the sale. So yeah, the sooner we get a new owner and a credible owner, an owner that's willing to invest with the assistance of the $1.9 billion package that the federal government and the state government have put on the table. The sooner we get that done, the better.
And what is the state government doing during this administration period, aside from, of course, passing that legislation and, really getting the ball running to get the steelworks back on an even keel?
Yeah, the state government's actually making a very significant financial contribution. We had planned, and in some respects, the initial civil work had started on a world first hydrogen power plant here in Whyalla with a 200 megawatt peaking station with 250 megawatts of electrolyzers and some storage. And that was when we had announced that prior to the 2022 election. That came with a price tag of around about the 600 million mark. Now we had to make a very difficult decision when it came to what our priorities were, and the priority was clearly ensuring the future of a viable steel industry in Whyalla. And so the hydrogen element, which is partly Whyalla's location was chosen based on the fact that we do have a steelworks here. So the hydrogen element has been shelved for the time being. It's so that money has now been freed up to put into that budgeted money has been freed up to be put into the steelworks.
And yet, bizarrely, of course, opposition leader Peter Dutton's come out this week saying he does back the government's bailout for the steelworks, but as long as the money doesn't go towards any hydrogen power. I mean, I first personally looking at that kind of remarks, I don't think it's really helping with that type of rhetoric, especially if you're talking about workers' livelihoods and an entire town of 22,000 people on the line. And given the fact that we're about to go into a federal election, we know that Peter Dutton needs as many votes as he can get to even have a go at getting into government again.
Yeah, and it's an interesting comment, and it partly reflects his level of ignorance when it comes to iron and steel making. It's because the hydrogen wasn't, if you like, a power source, even though it could provide power for the steelworks. The important thing about hydrogen, and this is long term, and I've always been very upfront in stating that when it comes to hydrogen, we've got to be able to provide it. We're talking about renewable-based hydrogen. We've got to be able to provide it commercially at scale, and we're some way away from being able to do that. But the important thing about hydrogen is that it is a substitute for coking coal in the iron making process. So it's a reductant in that process. And if you were using a direct reduction iron plant, which is what was planned, you'd be able to produce the essentially green iron to feed into the steel making process or potentially an export industry. Now, none of that is going to happen overnight, but we should have our eyes on the future, looking at that far horizon when we look at what the transition might be, because we've got literally billions of tons of magnetite that is particularly suited to direct reduction iron making and the use of, in the long term, the use of hydrogen. But as a transition process, if we go to direct reduction iron making, it's not going to be hydrogen overnight. It will be natural gas, and we need to improve the gas capacity to Whyalla if we go down that track. And if we go down that track, it sets us up when hydrogen is available commercially at scale, it sets us up for that transition. And it'll be interesting to watch what is happening globally. The Swedes, with their hybrid project, will be the first of the full-scale iron and steel producers using renewable-based hydrogen. So there'll be valuable learning lessons from that. Sometimes if you're going to be the first mover, sometimes there's risks that come with that, but there's also often real opportunities that come as well. But the overwhelming odds, we're not going to be the first mover. The Swedes, potentially others, will be the first mover. We can learn from that, and in the meantime, the costs in relation to some of the technologies, whether electrolyzers or what have you, will come down. So we should be looking to long term while looking at what the immediate steps are.
And this also comes at what could potentially be quite a vulnerable time for the steel industry itself. We know the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, is over in the United States at the moment. We are bracing, of course, for any potential tariffs, and given Donald Trump's very erratic behaviour as US president, we're not too sure, of course, what kind of tariffs, if any, would be applied, but also what industries. And we know that there has been concern from the Mayor of Whyalla, Phil Stone, about the whole industry being flooded with cheap steel, or there could be the potential trade war with China, which could make the situation in Whyalla very, very difficult, especially if steel prices fluctuate very badly or they struggle to compete with international exports.
Yeah, well, certainly the geopolitical situation and the nature of the Trump regime raised a whole raft of concerns. While it would not be in a direct sense impacted by the tariffs, we don't import product from Whyalla to the United States. But the point that the mayor was making, the collateral damage through the attempts to dump steel on the Australian market, and we can take action when it comes to dumping at a federal level. But it's always been my view that we need to improve our steel procurement policy in this country. And back in 2015, as the local member, I initiated the change to steel procurement policy in South Australia. It falls just short of mandating, but it's two elements of policy taken together benefits the steel industry here in Whyalla and in Australia. And indeed, at the time, the peak body for the steel industry, the Australian Steel Institute, said it was by far the best steel procurement policy in the nation. And I believe that we should move in that direction. We need to look after our manufacturing, but we need to do it in a smart way. We don't want other countries dumping products. Of course, dumping's got a particular meaning. They're putting product into your country under the cost of production. We don't want that.
And it's creating a glut in the market, which would affect supply and demand and prices, which also could create a knock-on effect for other businesses. Like here in the Northwest, of course, we have a major steel import company that refines all the steel in Tamworth, as well as all the mines around Gunnedah that need to use steel for construction, for infrastructure. So given any problems that could happen from Whyalla, this could have happened a knock-on effect for us here in the Northwest.
And I think it's that the federal government have to be alert to what is going on. You do not want to sacrifice essential industries on some sort of free market, free trade ideology. Now, I know that we are a trading nation, and so I know that this is always a question of balance. Our primary producers export a lot of product. We obviously export a lot of mineral product overseas, but we do need to ensure that we do retain some essential building blocks of our manufacturing capability. And structural steel and rail is one of those essential building blocks. And that's this whole issue about the period that we now live in, just this geopolitical turmoil that I think is going to get potentially a lot worse. One hope you hope not, but in periods like that, you don't want to be generate massive vulnerabilities through dependency on other countries. Now, like I said, this is always a question of balance. We run a big trade surplus with China. And we've seen it firsthand here in South Australia. As some of our lobster industry was really badly hit. Their barley producers were badly hit. The wine industry was badly hit. So we've got to be mindful of the overall complex picture and have smart politicians that can, if you like, find that balance.
Are you one of those smart politicians?
I'm just a humble backbencher.
Because often smart and politicians are not often used in the same sentence.
Yeah. Well, I think politicians are often given a hard time. Sometimes more than deserved at times. But at other times it's a lot of hard work goes on, often behind the scenes that people don't see. So I think most people are there to try and do the best, but it's complicated.
And finally, Mr. Hughes, how is the mood in Whyalla at the moment? When I spoke to Mayor Stone last week, the town was jubilant, and you figure out if a company's being put into administration, not just into administration, but by the state government, this could often be one of concern or anger or uncertainty. But he told me that the people are just jubilant. And that is something that you never heard.
It's an incredibly, administration and happiness that usually do not go together. But in this case, the uplift in mood in the community, because people are just over the uncertainty, and they wanted action taken. And I think the action that's been taken has the scale of it has taken people by surprise. And one of the issues there that we haven't really mentioned is that a lot of the small and medium-sized contractors, locally based or South Australian based, that were owed a lot of money by GFG, that work had dried up almost completely without any transition. For some of the essential ones, GFG still wanted to go in and do work, but they weren't going to pay them. So that wasn't going to happen.
Well, it also shows a lot of very big concerns about how that company has been operating. And we know as of today, several executives have departed GFG Alliance.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's a lot of queries and questions about how Mr. Gupta has been running this company, because we believe that it could potentially be on the brink. And we know that he's trying to at least salvage something. But given the fact of what you've told me and what we've seen over the past week, this is a company that is in dire straits.
Yeah, when you look at it, my understanding is, and I'm happy to be corrected, that in that GFG empire, there's 200 shell companies. So the complexity, the layer there complexity is amazing. But the thing about what we've done here in Whyalla is the package that we provided for this largely local contractor base, often family businesses that have been built up over the years, often very specialised skills. They were in dire straits. One or two have already gone to the wall, and a whole heap of others were going to go to the wall. And what we managed to do is just get rid of that. What we managed to do was put in place a package that, when we announced it, was a room full of contractors. There was initially stunned silence, and then the Premier goes, "I thought you might be pleased with this," and then it was just the massive applause, because people could not believe what they were hearing. And some of those companies went out, some of the owners of those companies went out and got very pissed at me. So, in celebration, there was a few bottles of bubbles and other stuff cracked that night, because it's been a massive relief to those companies, and the enormous stress that GFG put them under.
And not just in, of course, Whyalla, but our old stomping grounds of Port Augusta and Port Pirie as well, and many of these smaller communities that have been trying to attract people back to the regions. And we know all this renewable energy, the mining industries from Lee Creek all the way to Port Augusta, the electrolyzers at Port Pirie, the increased tourism in Port Lincoln, and seeing what is wanting to be achieved. This almost could have been a massive roadblock, and we know how difficult it is to try and get people not only to come to these regional areas, but to get them to stay too.
Yeah, and the essential, we talk about having livability, and it's important. But ultimately, the underlying factor in all of this is having jobs and secure jobs and hopefully well-paid jobs. I think there's enormous potential in this region. The potential for BHP, they're looking to triple copper production, which is going to have a massive impact on this state. There's a whole range of projects around the region. Some will get up, some won't get up, but there is a positive vibe. And unfortunately, what's going on with GFG was undermining that positive vibe. You mentioned the other communities. We've got people in Port Augusta that work here in Whyalla at the Steelworks. We've got Whyalla people working in Port Augusta, maybe at the prison or elsewhere. So these communities, we travel between ourselves, jobs in different communities. But I know, having lived in this community for a long time, that one of the things that makes a difference is a secure employment base in a community. And when you don't have that, you have a whole raft of issues.
Eddie Hughes, thank you for joining Firstline.
Oh, it's good to see you again. Yes, all the best.
State Member for Giles, Eddie Hughes there. And that is Firstline for now. I'm Daniel Pizarro. Thank you so much for your company. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you later. Good night.